In this video, I'm going to be upgrading a Splatrball gearbox from plastic gears to metal gears, and also upgrading the piston to one with metal gears and the piston head, and even upgrading the spring. I would only upgrade to the metal gears if the plastic gears have stripped and they're not working anymore. It's possible to preemptively upgrade to metal gears even if your plastic gears are not worn out, to give the blaster more longevity, and then you won't have to worry about the gears stripping in the future. The components that you're going to need for this upgrade are a set of high quality metal gears. Here's an 18:1 ratio. This is a SHS brand gears, but they're resold by Rocket. A pinion for the motor. This is a D-shaped pinion gear because the stock motor has a D-shaped shaft. You're going to need a new anti-reverse latch. Now this is not exactly the right one for this model, and we'll see why later, but it can be modified to work. There are also other options you can buy that would work better than this anti-reverse latch. You're going to need some shims to adjust the spacing of the gears. You're going to need a new piston body with a metal gear rack. So the pickup gear is the first tooth. The second tooth has been removed because what happens is the sector gear could prematurely engage with the second tooth instead of the pickup gear. This is a SHS brand, high quality piston body. And you're going to need a new piston head, especially since the Splatrball piston head is non-standard in terms of the spacing of the O-ring, so you can't use standard O-rings. This piston head has some bearings on the back for the spring. It's okay to buy a piston head like this. It's recommended by a lot of people to instead have the bearings on the backside support of the spring because these bearings just add mass to the piston head, which is not really a good thing. This piston head is sold as a silent piston head because it has this rubber bumper on the front. However, I've read that people say that this is not really worth it, but whatever. You can also just cut that bump off if you don't want it, or we're probably going to have to cut that bump down a little bit to adjust the angle of engagement of the gears, which is often referred to as AOE. If you want to use a stock spring, you can use a stock spring. If you want to upgrade the spring for a little bit higher FPS, then this is an M90 spring, which is the first upgrade I'm going to try. I don't know that I'd push it much more than that with a plastic gearbox. Something interesting I want to point out, this gearbox came with the SRB400 sub, which is the blue model. This gearbox came with the orange model, which is the rifle with the stock. Now, I took this gearbox apart for my takedown video, and I made a comment in the video that there was a set screw missing from the bottom of this motor cage to adjust the position of the motor and the engagement into the bevel gear. What I noticed is on the orange one that I took apart, the rifle model, is that that set screw is there. So I don't know why the set screw is missing on the blue sub model and the set screw is there on the orange model. What that tells me is that you're probably much more likely to strip the gears if you don't have it on yours, because then you cannot adjust the engagement of the pinion gear with the bevel gear like you can when the set screw is there. So I'm going to be adding a set screw to this SRB400 sub blue version that came without it. All right, the first thing we're going to do is disassemble this whole gearbox. If you want to see a full video of that, then click up here in the top right corner for the full video of the gearbox disassembly. I'm not going to cover that in this video. One of the easiest components to replace is going to be this pinion gear on the motor. So we take a large flathead screwdriver and pop off the old pinion gear by going underneath it like that. It's going to pop off pretty fast, so just put your finger over it to keep it from springing away. And we're going to take our new pinion gear, the metal one. Be careful, it's got a little tiny set screw that comes with it. Don't lose that. The set screw is not yet engaged with the bevel gear. It's not going to hurt to put a tiny little bit of blue thread locker on this set screw. Because we don't want it vibrating loose. Make sure the pinion gear is seated all the way so it's flush with the end of the motor shaft. And then tighten it up. So once you've removed the cover from the gearbox, then take note of where all these gears go and the shims of that. Keep everything together because we don't want to lose track of stuff for being able to put it back together. You can always watch this video again. Oops, there we go. There's a bearing fell on the bottom there with a shim. So all of these gears have a shim on both sides. This one too. The sector gear also has a shim on both sides. This ratchet pawl is a little bit different from the ratchet pawl that I purchased. The ratchet pawl I purchased has this wider area on the shaft that's probably designed for a metal gearbox. So here, instead on this gearbox, they have a long post here that you could trim down flush to the housing to get it to work, but I think there's a reason that they did this because the plastic is not as strong. So what I was able to do is tap out the pin using a hammer. It was really easy. I just put this over a hole, tapped it out using a hammer, came out no problem. And then I'm left with a metal ratchet pawl. I'm just going to replace this ratchet pawl in here with the metal one. The metal one is a tiny bit thinner, so I'm going to add some washers and spacers to kind of center it. This tappet plate is always looking bent. And the other one I took apart too is bent. I suspect those tappet plates bend and then they break here and then they come off. So these tappet plates aren't very long in the tooth and probably going to have to be replaced soon. If you have it open, you can bend your tappet plate back a little bit by hand. This metal is pretty soft. Let's compare this piston to the piston that we purchased. So the teeth on the piston body that we purchased have a little bit different engagement positions. You can see that this initial pickup tooth is the same height, but then the rest of the teeth start at a different point. So we're going to have to see how well this works. And we may have to do a little bit of modifications to the sector gear if the sector gear is not releasing properly at the end, because we don't want to jam the gearbox. The sector gear should pick up fine, but it may have trouble releasing based on where these teeth are positioned. This new piston head has the bearings on the back, and you unscrew the screw on the back here to mount it. This is another screw, a little bit of Loctite would be good on. So here's the thrust bearing. So you can see how this thrust bearing doesn't come all the way to the top. There's a little gap. So the purpose of this thrust bearing is to allow the spring to kind of rotate as it compresses, because as it compresses and decompresses, the spring kind of wants to wind up and rotate. So this allows it to rotate freely. You're going to get better performance from the spring. However, it seems that most airsofters recommend to have these bearings on the spring support, which is on the back of the spring. So this one that came with the Splatrball, it has this little washer here that's acting as a bearing. It's up to you whether you leave this bearing in or take it out. If you take it out, it's going to lighten up the head a little bit, but I think that's only really useful for very high rate of fire setups. I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite in this thread. Put this on the end of the piston body. It's probably a good idea to add some of this grease to the bearing. Now we're going to have to support this bearing on a screwdriver, like a number 2 screwdriver, like that. Screws out the end, then put the piston head on, and screw that in. Okay, so now if we compare these two piston head bodies together, what you'll notice is that the new one is much longer than the old one. So we're going to have to do some modifications to the angle of engagement and everything to get this new one to work. Ideally, what we maybe want is one with a shorter head on it. Now, I can't reuse the original piston head because it uses a non-standard O-ring spacing. The O-ring spacing of this is about 2.44, and that means it uses a small O-ring. The standard spacing for airsoft and other gel blasters is 3 millimeters, which allows you to use a standard large O-ring here. So we can use like the green O-rings, which are supposedly really good for sealing. Okay, I can't really do anything on the piston head side to shorten the stroke. So you can see here where there's a gap because of this bump. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to trim off the bump on the piston head to shorten the stroke and improve the angle of engagement. Let me use a sharp knife to trim off the end of this piston. Oh, I hit the metal in there. It's a metal rod on the inside. Turn off a little bit more. So I think that what we discovered overall is that this piston head is not ideal for this conversion, but it will work if lightly modified. So it turns out that there's a problem with this Splatrball gearbox. And when I looked on the Gel Blaster forums in Australia, people reported the same problem with the G36C gearbox and trying to add metal gears to it and adding a plunger. This is the piston plunger with a metal rack. Is that the standard piston plungers are too loose in here. You can see how loose it is, moves around. And what happens is it comes off of the track, then your gear disengage and it jams up. Here, you can see it, like right there. Came off the track. I don't know if you can notice the amount of space there is in there, but it's really loose. It can come off the track from the pressure from the sector gear, and then it jams up and it just won't work anymore. Unfortunately, there aren't any other known plungers that work with this gearbox assembly. So the solution that one person pointed out is to add a piece of plastic on top of the plunger to keep it from getting pushed off of the track. So basically it'd be riding on the plastic on top and it wouldn't get pushed off of the track and it wouldn't lose its alignment and it would continue to mesh with the gears. I have this random piece of cylindrical plastic that looks like nylon, UHMW, something that's pretty slippery, pretty strong. It's a little bit under 1 millimeter thick, which is going to be perfect for sliding into here. So I'm going to cut this to size and get it to fit on here. Here you can see the dimensional difference between these two plungers. So this is the stock plunger, 20.15 between the track, and then over the track is 22.37. And this one is 18.78 between the track, and over the track is 21.6. So here 22.3. There's a good bit of difference, at least enough that it won't stay on the track. Okay, so this piece of tubing of 1 millimeter wall thickness by somewhere between 18 to 19 millimeters of ID, cut to shape to fit the top of the piston plunger so that it won't move around, is a perfect fit into the gearbox. It does two things. It helps keep the plunger centered on the track, and it helps keep it from getting pushed up off of the track too. So I'm going to clean up this surface and this surface with some alcohol, and then I'm going to glue that down with some super glue so it stays on there, it doesn't come off. I wrapped a rubber band around the piece of plastic and the plunger while the glue was curing to keep everything tight. So now this 1 millimeter thick piece of plastic is glued onto the plunger. I'm going to go ahead and replace this stock O-ring that came with it with a better quality O-ring. The main difference I can see with the stock O-ring is that the seam has a lot of flash where the mold came together that the other higher quality O-rings do not. So this black one here is a Viton O-ring, and this green one is a fluoroelastomer generic green O-ring. This is what gel ball players refer to as the green O-rings. So this has a lot better seam along the edge. It's much less noticeable. And this Viton O-ring, it has practically no seam at the edge. It's barely visible. So the Viton O-ring has by far the best molding quality. This green O-ring is pretty good, probably good enough. The green O-ring seems a little bit more flexible than the Viton, but they're probably very similar in properties. I'm just going to go ahead and try the green O-ring. As I reassemble the piston into the cylinder, I'm going to add some lubrication to this. Put some lubrication inside the cylinder. Oh, that was a lot. Spread that out. Spread that in this track too. Okay, when you go to put this O-ring back in, you're going to have to kind of angle it like this and then squeeze the O-ring in, make sure you don't pinch it anywhere. Test to see how much compression you're getting. Compression seems to be very good. You can wipe the excess grease off of the outside of the cylinder. Something to take note is that the cam feature on the stock plastic gear is different from the cam feature on the metal gear. The metal gear just has a pin. This one has a wider feature here. And so we want to simulate this feature, and we can do it using something called a sector delay chip. So you can buy sector delay chips. In this case, I modeled one that simulates this plastic gear's sector cam. So I've got a few here, and I probably need to trim them a little bit to clean them up. Here's the finished sector delay chip. I had to drill out the hole a little bit, sand the top, sand the surface to get it to fit, but now it seems to fit well. Is this engagement normal here? It seems to want to push up against that third tooth instead of engaging with it and pull away from the pickup tooth. Now there's a gap where the pickup tooth doesn't seem right. This is an SHS 14-tooth piston plunger, and these are SHS gears resold as Rocket. So something weird is going on here. Here's an SHS 15-tooth piston plunger, and it seems to mesh a lot better. Like when I start from the pickup gear, then it seems to mesh correctly, but the teeth don't go in as deep into each other. But here it doesn't pull away from the pickup tooth like the other one does. This is the mesh of the stock piston plunger. Here's the pickup tooth, and everything seems to mesh really well. There's not that weird gap. If I position the SHS 14-tooth plunger and the SHS 15-tooth plunger side by side and line up the gears, you'll notice that the pickup tooth is a different position on the 14-tooth plunger versus the 15-tooth plunger. See how the pickup gears don't align? Since I discovered that the teeth don't mesh properly between the sector gear and the rack on the piston, I'm going to have to change over to this other one where they do mesh properly. So I had to glue on another piece of plastic on this one. This was the SHS 15-tooth piston. The 14-tooth piston doesn't seem to work correctly. Now, because the 15-tooth piston on the left has a little bit different engagement position of the first tooth, I'm going back to this plunger head that has the rubber bumper on here, and I'm going to see how that works and readjust again, because when I tried with this one that I had cut off, it was actually too short and it wasn't engaging properly at the right position. So now what I'm seeing here with the rubber-tipped plunger head is that the angle of engagement is good, but this tooth sticks out so far that it's rubbing against the gear here. I don't know how they make this stuff or what they expect you to do, like you have to shim down everything or something. I'm going to grind this tooth down a little bit. It meshes properly. I'm also going to have to remove the last tooth on the sector gear because here it doesn't release. So it's going to have to release from the tooth before the last one. So we're going to grind that down also at the same time.